Eloise in Oxonia, a creative podcast by the Oxford Writers' House. Follow English student Eloise Weaver as she moves through the city of Oxford, encountering stories, past and present. Eloise's adventures are fantasy, but the authors, people and ideas she encounters are as real as you and I.
I wake up in darkness this morning, but when I draw the blinds, yellow light floods my room. Iris and I are going punting on the river today. Our river walks have become more frequent, and we have grown closer. Apart from yourself, listener, Iris is really the only person I trust here. After so many miserable days of darkness and rain, the light feels pleasant and foreign on my skin. There are primroses and crocuses popping up all over the college lawns. Spring is in full force, and sometimes we taste hints of summer. Sparrows twitter rhapsodies in the branches. Over breakfast, I catch Jax and Quincy side-eyeing me at the end of the table, whispering to one another like churchgoers. I ignore them. Nothing is going to ruin this day.
The fountains mingle with the river, and the rivers with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single. All things by a law divine in one another's being mingle. Why not I with thine? See? The mountains kiss high heaven, and the waves clasp one another. No sister flower could be forgiven if it disdained its brother. And the sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth, if thou kiss not me?
Iris is wearing an ensemble of dark purple, and her hair has been recently dyed a complementary hue of indigo. She is fiddling with a rolly cigarette and puffing out air to keep wisps of hair away from her face. "Good morning, Turtle Dove," she says cheerfully. "Are you ready?" We walk towards Magdalen College, where the punts are held. Magnolia trees and cherry blossoms are blooming, and the air is perfumed with sugar. Down at the riverbank, we see students gathering to pick up their punts. Punting is a tradition going back only 100 years. It was originally developed to cart practical items like luggage and fishing tack up the river. Nowadays, it's a leisure activity. Students sip Pimms with strawberries, dangle fingers over the edge of their punts, and ogle swans or overhanging willow branches. Punting is a reverie, a ritual, done for the pure, superfluous pleasure of the activity. It takes a whole afternoon to do a decent circuit in Oxonia, so we penciled in the whole afternoon, packed some sandwiches and drinks, and, in Iris's case, rolled a dozen cigarettes into neat little caterpillars. The long, flat boats are propelled by one brave soul who stands on the back of the punt, pushing a single, enormous bar into the riverbed, moving the punt slowly along. Iris and I will take turns navigating the wooden craft. The river glistens in the afternoon sun. The gentle current pushes us along. Iris and I steer the punt toward the bend. The air is crisp with the scent of wet grass, and the sounds of birds chirping from the banks create a peaceful rhythm. But that calm is shattered the moment we round the corner. There, in the middle of the river coming directly at us, are Quincy and Jax. They are unmistakable. Two smug grins plastered across their faces on a punt, with a large jar of strawberry Pimms and a bottle of champagne between them. Jax is punting, and Quincy lounges in the centre, sipping a fluted glass. Have they been waiting for us? "Well, hello," Quincy calls, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who decides to show up. Out for a little cruise. Care for a push?" Iris tenses beside me. I look back and see her hands gripping the pole a little too tight and her knuckles going a sickly green colour. "Don't let them get to you," I murmur. Before I can stop her, Iris gives a sharp shove with the pole, attempting to steer us past them. Jax is faster. He lunges forward, swinging his pole towards us with deliberate force. It catches our punt side with a jarring thud, and we veer violently to the right. "Oopsie," he chuckles. "That wasn't very well thought out, was it?" Iris screams as a low-hanging branch slaps her across the face, scratching it badly. The punt rocks beneath us. With a sharp cry of pain, Iris loses her footing. Her arms flail as she tries to catch herself, but there is nothing to hold on to. In a breathless moment, she topples backward, crashing into the water with a splash that sends waves rippling across the surface. Quincy and Jax burst out laughing, leaning over the edge of their own punt. "Nice one, Iris," Jax taunts, his voice thick with amusement. "Didn't realise you were so eager for a swim." I rush to extend my hand to her, but Iris has already surfaced, her long hair plastered against her face, her eyes burning with fury. There are streaks of blood running down her face. Jax and Quincy disappear around the bend, still laughing at us. I reach down to pull Iris back onto the punt. I try to brush off leaves and petals that cling to her drenched clothes and skin. Her hair is tangled from the fall. She doesn't seem to notice the cold, though. Her eyes are focused in the direction of Quincy and Jax. They're getting further away, but I can feel the anger radiating from her, sharp and unforgiving. "They'll regret this," she says, her voice low but fierce. I nod, my heart racing, but it's not just from the confrontation. It's from the way she looks at me now, her eyes softening just slightly, her breath coming a little faster. The air between us has shifted somehow. I step closer, almost without realizing it, the small gap between us closing. Her lips part, like she's about to say something, but then her gaze flickers to my lips. Just for a moment. The world pauses. I don't think, I just act. I lean in, my heart pounding harder than it ever has, and when our lips meet, it's electric. There's no hesitation, no awkwardness, just a fierce need to be closer, to feel something real. Her body is cold, and we entwine gently. There is nothing outside of this moment. Her hands come up to my arms. I pull her in just a bit more, feeling the pulse of her heartbeat against mine. For a moment, I forget about everything but the salty taste of her kiss, the way she fits so perfectly in my arms. She pulls back slightly, breathless, her eyes wide and searching mine. There's a soft smile on her face, something shy but content. "Do you think they saw?" she asks, her voice a mix of amusement and uncertainty. I chuckle, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "I don't care," I say. There's a quiet understanding between us now, an unspoken promise that this, whatever this is, feels like the beginning of something we didn't expect, but both need. I take over the punt, steering us back to the collection point. Iris wraps herself in our picnic blanket. This moment feels immortal, but fleeting. My mind wanders back to lectures. I have an odd thought. For every famous author who has punted on this river, there must be 100 authors whose works have faded from collective memory. Their works are bound in leather and embossed in gold, but nobody reads them, nobody circulates them. Sometimes this is down to politics or personality. I recall one American lecturer who told us about the 19th century author Katherine Lee Bates, who came here as a visiting student. I find it sad that after a lifetime of writing, editing, lecturing and speaking to the public, Katherine Lee Bates faded into relative obscurity. Only one song, a poem she jotted down casually in a notebook whilst travelling, still hummed by school children and over football fields all over the country. My lecturer said Bates used prize money from her first novel Rose and Thorn to travel and study here, but no one seems to recognise her name. Who was Katherine Lee Bates?
Well, Katherine Lee Bates was born in 1859 on the eve of the Civil War in a small village on Cape Cod, Falmouth, Massachusetts, outside Boston. So she lived, her life spanned 1859 to 1929. So it spanned a lot of crises, I would say, in international history, politics, and American politics, too. She was the fourth child in a family. Her father was a minister, congregational minister on the Big Green in Falmouth, and her mother had been a school teacher before marrying her father. And so it was quite an educated family. Her ancestors had been ministers, so they had books of their sermons sitting on their table in their parlor and all. And so there was a complete feminist kind of component to her household. Her mother had gone to the blacksmith father. Catherine's grandfather had sent her mother and her mother's sister to Mount Holyoke when it was not a college yet, but it was something that was going to be a college. And so this blacksmith father believed in women's education. And so the idea of a woman being educated was all the way through Catherine's life. And this was a big passion of hers. And unfortunately, her father died when she was a baby, so the mother had to make ends meet for this family of 4 little children, which she did. There in Falmouth, it was a community of women because the husbands had gone to sea or then died and later been killed in the Civil War. So the women ran the village. They had to. So this was what Katherine saw. And there was a dramatic scene in her childhood when Lincoln has been assassinated. The Congregational Church is having a memorial service, and they'd ask the women in the town for their black shawls she used to help decorate the church because the little general store had run out of black fabric. And so Katherine was 5 years old, walked in, and she wrote a poem about this much later, saying that when she saw her mother's mourning shawl there decorating the church, she felt connected to the nation. She came to Wellesley then in 1890 to 91, and she had already published a prize-winning novel for young adults called Rose and Thorn, and it was to show the problems in the class system, even in the United States, with the rich living a life apart from the poor and not having any idea about the poor. And there are these scenes of the houses in New York City, the sweatshops where the women were the seamstresses and all. And Katherine won $700 from the Congregational Society for her book, and she spent that money. And then one of the trustees at Wellesley gave her a loan of $350. I think she proudly repaid it so she could have her year in Oxford. So she wasn't really on sabbatical because she wasn't a tenured full professor yet. So that is why she came to Oxford in 1890 and 91. And she came with her friend Annie Beecher Scoville. And Annie had been her student. She was 5 or 6 years younger than Katherine. She was from the famous Beecher family. Harriet Beecher Stowe was her great aunt, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then she had another uncle who'd had a very salacious court case, a minister. They arrived in Oxford. They sort of toured around. When I say toured, they were hiking around the British Isles after they arrived, actually in Scotland, in the beginning of the summer. Then they rented a flat, 2 floors on Walton Street, not too far from the train station, right? So they had their flat. They decorated it with a little flag, American flag, over the chandelier. And then they bought Oxford china so they could have enough cups and saucers to have their at-homes on a certain afternoon. So that was the beginning of her stay at Oxford. Again, these 2 themes, the feminism, I would call it, the interest in women's lives, run through her stay in England. In this book, Rose and Thorn, the British wife of the American man who doesn't know anything about poverty, and they're surprised with their niece and the niece's activism. And she says something to him, "Didn't you realize that an American woman can learn all these things and can do them all. So, Katherine was thinking about the Brits and Americans. Even on this tour around England and Scotland that she and Annie took first, she was always aware of the money and the class system in England, especially when she knew how Wellesley was struggling to build its buildings. And, she did love looking around the town of Oxford. She writes that she was beginning to explore the bewildering 22 colleges and some 4 halls, besides all sorts of historic old buildings. And so, she went to the Evensong at Magdalen College Chapel, and they went to a service, she and Annie, at Christ Church Cathedral. But then she wrote to her mother, "We have no kings to tax the commons and endow colleges, and I'm glad of it. But still, Oxford is a place to make even the least bit of a scholar envious for the old books and the rare old manuscripts." She felt that the richness, the wealth that was obvious in the buildings and all, this was a contrast to the United States. So then when she could do 2 types really of, we would call it learning. The first was that she would attend lectures that were open to American men and any woman, because of course they couldn't become enrolled as students at Oxford. So these lectures were given by university lecturers who lectured to this special group of Americans over here. And for the first time in her life, she was being taught by men. This was a new experience for her. Of course, she was surrounded by men too. She'd lived such a cloistered life, with women all and at the college and her own college when she was a student and then later. So she listened to these lectures. Some of those lectures were just for women, but then twice a week she could attend ones that were co-ed on her specialties of Middle English, the history of Anglo-Saxon literature, and Old English. That was her field. And so she was initially shocked at the attitudes of these men. Dr. Wright, her old English professor, was, she wrote, trained in Germany and very rough and gruff, and he hates American students, especially women, says they have no ability anyway, only a little shallow enthusiasm. But she says she found his course interesting, and it wakes up all the student in me again. And I have been impatient with my own students too often to feel that I am getting any more than my fair recompense when this choleric gentleman wants to throw the table at me. I silently protest against his theory, but I am very glad to get it. And then she said she found a likable honesty about him, but what a savage. Said he never looked at modern literature anyhow. Even worse, she felt, was that to him, philology is everything, and the literature, nothing. He was vastly disgusted at my preference of literature to philology. He says he used to read poetry himself. Yes, used to write poetry, but all that was pure ignorance. He would rather read a page of the dictionary any day than a page of Browning or Shakespeare. Poets, he said, why, they don't even know the meaning of the words they used. Those were her lecturers. But she was taken one day to the famous scriptorium, James Murray's scriptorium, where the OED was being made, the Oxford English Dictionary. This place, of course, this was low ceilinged, had all these little cubby holes where people put their pieces of paper. They were now working on the letter C. It was a long, narrow room without windows, lit by gaslight. And so she says, well, we entered Dr. Murray's sanctum late in the afternoon, and the air was almost unbreathable. He very courteously began an explanation of the whole long process. I was vastly interested at first. Then I became aware, to my horror, that his voice was getting further and further away, and the room was turning black and beginning to swim. I clutched the table and held out a moment or two longer, thinking how awfully illiterate it would look to the English mind if an American should faint away at the mere sight of their dictionary. But it was no use. I had to make a hurried excuse and just succeeded in getting to the door where the open air, fog and all, was blessedness. The assistants sprang for a chair and a glass of water and the like with very suspicious alacrity, and I've been told that nothing pleases them so much as to have a lady turn faint in their dreadful little prison hole. Dr. Murray, though I returned a few minutes later, regarded me with sorrowful disapproval and cut his explanations short. I think this was the lesson to her that American women should stay away from dictionaries in Oxford. So she was always an outsider as an American. And her social life, though, involved American men who were there studying at the newly opened Mansfield College. It had been opened for dissenters by the Congregational Church, who wanted their men who were training to be ministers to come there to Mansfield to study. So that is where she and Annie made these friends with the young American men who were there, their age, maybe a little younger. And one in particular, Oscar Triggs, became her companion, and he was so into social reform that he was both, I think, a romantic interest and also a teacher to her, even though he was younger. So he took her one night to a debate that was being held in the Oxford Town Hall about trade unions. And so he opened her eyes that way to, he wanted her to become an activist. She preferred to be in her ivory tower, really. But her other colleagues at Wellesley, who were Mr. Durant had hired and who came in later, were social activists. They might be writers, but they were social activists. And so Oscar fed this interest that she already had. And then he took her around. He was reading William Morris, and he took her around to see the pre-Raphaelite art in some of the different colleges. So she had the experience of having male companionship for the first time in her life. So Oscar, you got to give it to Oscar. Now, he didn't write to her after she returned after her year there. He was still there for another year in Oxford. And then in the end, nothing came of this romance, I'll say it that way. But they kept in touch as scholars. And in the United States, they had debates in some of the literary magazines. And, she took one side, he took another. And she saw him in Boston at the Boston Browning Society meetings. He took a job then at the newly formed University of Chicago. So she was still, it was a continuing, I guess I would say, a continuing friendship with him over the years. But it was important that year at Oxford because Annie went home in the spring of 1891. Then Katherine had a lot more time and also wasn't chaperoned in their flat. And so, she might write to her mother, she discouraged all these young men, nipped them in the bud. But in her diary, she writes about being out very late at night and they did hear the cuckoo. And, I think Oscar gave her, it was an important relationship for her. Another strain of being the outsider there was for Katherine, she'd been educated in British literature, of course. And then Mr. Durant, the Wellesley founder, had collected first editions of British writers. So he had all these first editions and he subscribed to literary journals. He had all these in the college library. And that was what she used to prepare for her teaching of English lit. All this material was there at Wellesley that she was familiar with. So she felt, of course, she understood that American literature, and with Longfellow's interest in sort of making American literature a field, this was something that she was thinking about a lot at the time because she wanted America, what was she going to do with American writing? Because here she is, of course, in England, in Oxford, studying Old English, Middle English, and the English religious plays. So she went ahead with those. So her scholarship was, she could use the Bodleian Library. So she was reading these texts and taking notes. And then after that year, she did write a book called English Religious Drama. And that was the book that eventually took her to Colorado Springs to teach in their summer school. She was teaching Chaucer out there on the kind of prairie in the, below the Rocky Mountains. And that's where she then took the trip up Pikes Peak looked out at the Purple Mountain Majesties and was inspired to write the beginnings of America the Beautiful, the song, the words to the song that made her so famous the rest of her life.
In the evening, we dress for pre-dinner academic announcements in the JCR. The room is filled with the low murmur of students adjusting ties, fixing blouses and smoothing down skirts. I can feel the weight of the anticipation in the air, thick with excitement. The announcement for each subject is brief, followed by polite applause. Our top mathematics paper this term goes to Jacoby Kingsley Harrington. Jack stands up to receive his award, beaming. He winks at me. Our top paper in physics award goes to Phoebe Pemberton Wellington. Applause. The announcements drone on for a while. Then I hear, and our top paper for English this term goes to Eloise Weaver. I go to shake hands with the tutor, trying to ignore fluttering nerves in my chest. When I reach the front, the eyes of my peers are all on me, some admiring, others indifferent. But the pair of eyes I can't ignore are Jack's and Quincy's. Their expressions are almost identical. Tight lips, narrowed eyes, the corners of their mouths pulled into something halfway between a sneer and a scowl. It's not hard to see that they're not pleased, and I can almost feel the weight of their judgment settle over me like a cloud. I force myself to smile, accepting the award from the head tutor, shaking their hand with a poise that feels far more confident than I feel inside. The applause continues, but it sounds distant now, as if coming from deep underwater. All I can think of is the cruel look on Jax's face. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I notice something even more unnerving. A hooded figure in the far corner of the room, face obscured. As soon as I notice it, the figure disappears out the door and down the hallway, blending swiftly into late afternoon shadow. I return to my seat. Iris leans over with a grin and squeezes my knee. Don't let them get to you. She must have seen the boys giving me the dirty look. I nod, but it doesn't fully ease the tension I feel creeping under my skin. Dinner is served soon after the scholars' announcement, but the mood feels stifling. There is a sense of unease hanging in the air. The usual chatter at our table is muted, like everyone's waiting for something to happen. Can you feel it? Iris asks, her voice barely above a whisper as she leans in towards me. They're just waiting to make this awkward. I glance over at Jax and Quincy. Jax is playing with his fork, stabbing at his food more aggressively than necessary, while Quincy is leaning back in his chair, arms crossed tightly. Their faces are masks of thinly veiled irritation. They won't get the satisfaction of ruining this night, I say, pushing back the surge of frustration. I worked hard for this, and I'm not letting them take it from me. Iris gives me an encouraging smile. Exactly. You deserve this. As we continue with the meal, I try to ignore the whispers and the sideways glances. I can feel their eyes on me, on my every move, every bite, but I refuse to let it show. At the end of the night, Iris and I walk back to our rooms together, the cool evening air offering some relief from the tension. You did amazing, she says, nudging me with her shoulder. Thanks, I reply, my smile a little more genuine this time. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. You've earned that reward, she says. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I settle into my small bed, feeling satisfied. Tomorrow might bring more challenges and tests, but tonight I'm going to savour the feeling of having done something well.
Episode 9 of Eloise in Oxonia was produced by Sid Walter and written by Dr. April Power. The episode features original readings by Esme Rhodes, Judith Bunting and Kian Power. Keira Knightley reads the work of Percy Bysshe Shelley. Our interviewed expert is Professor Melinda M. Ponder. Special thanks go to the Poetry Archive for their expert support.